The Brookfield sisters. The Brookfield house stood on the edge of the small New England town of Heatherwood, a humble, well-loved home tucked among the trees. Inside, the parlor was a picture of modest coziness, faded floral wallpaper, a well-worn armchair by the hearth, and a low table scattered with half-read books, ribbons, and sewing materials. The light of early spring filtered through the curtains, illuminating four sisters gathered together, each absorbed in her own pursuit. Lydia, the eldest at 20, was stitching a patch on the family quilt, her dark hair pinned neatly in a bun, reflecting her sense of responsibility and gentle demeanor. She glanced occasionally at her sisters, feeling both the weight of being the eldest and the warmth of being among those she loved most. Josephine, or Josie, was leaning over the table, furiously writing in her leather-bound journal, her pen moving as swiftly as her thoughts. At 18, Josie's head was filled with stories, debates, and the ambition to see her name in print one day. Her dark curls were forever escaping her hairpin, a constant rebellion she never had time to fix. "Must you scribble so loudly, Josie?" complained Sarah, the third sister, who was sitting near the window sketching a flower arrangement she intended to paint. At 16, Sarah was as delicate as her artwork, with a serene, dreamy nature. She spent much of her time in her own world of colors and brushes, sometimes coming across as distant, but always with a kind smile that brought comfort to others. "Let her write," chimed in Annie, the youngest at 14, who was sprawled on the floor flipping through a thick book on astronomy. Annie was a curious mixture of impishness and wonder, more interested in the stars above than the everyday worries of the household. Her light brown hair fell loosely around her face, as wild as her imagination. "Someday, Sarah, you'll be grateful for my loud scribbling when I write you into a play," Josie shot back, waving her pen theatrically. "And Lydia, of course, will sew the costumes, while Annie can discover a new planet and call it Brookfield." "Brookfieldia," Annie corrected with a grin. "It sounds more dignified." Lydia laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "And who will keep the house in order while you all chase fame and fortune?" "You will, of course," Sarah replied sweetly, her eyes still on her sketch. "You were born to keep us in line, Lydia." "I'd like to think I was born for more than sweeping and mending," Lydia said with a sigh. But there was no bitterness in her voice, only a hint of longing that she quickly swallowed down. It was a sentiment she rarely let herself dwell on, but it sometimes slipped out when she was alone with her sisters. A knock at the door interrupted the light-hearted banter. Annie jumped up, eager to break the monotony, and swung the door open to reveal Mrs. Mayhew, the neighbor, clutching a basket of bread. "Good morning, girls," Mrs. Mayhew greeted, her smile bright but tired. She was a widow of modest means, always eager to offer help despite her own struggles. "I brought some fresh loaves. Figured you could use them with your growing appetites." "You're too kind, Mrs. Mayhew," Lydia said, taking the basket and offering a chair, but Mrs. Mayhew waved her hand. "No time to sit today. I just wanted to tell you about a certain piece of news that's making the rounds in town," she said, her eyes sparkling. "Seems the old Sutton estate has been sold." "That dusty old mansion?" Josie asked, intrigued. The Sutton estate had been empty for years, a source of rumors and ghost stories for the children of Heatherwood. "Yes, indeed, and not only sold, but soon to be inhabited," Mayhew continued. "The new owner is young Mr. Elliot Grant from Boston. Word is he's a businessman with grand plans to start a factory in town." Josie's eyes widened at this news. "A factory? What sort of factory?" "Shoes, I believe," Mrs. Mayhew replied. "He's bringing opportunity, they say. Might be some good jobs for folks, but you know how it goes. Change never comes quietly." "Change is exactly what this town needs," Josie said, her eyes lighting up. "Perhaps Mr. Grant will need a writer to document his endeavors." "And a painter for portraits," Sarah added thoughtfully, looking out the window toward the direction of the Sutton estate. Or perhaps he needs a lady astronomer to study the stars from his big, empty mansion, Annie said, half joking, half hopeful. Lydia shook her head with a tolerant smile. Or perhaps we should focus on the sewing I need help with. Remember, we have a church bazaar coming up, and I promised Mrs. O'Brien 12 aprons. The girls groaned, but reluctantly picked up the fabric Lydia handed them. Yet even as they returned to their work, the news of Mr. Grant lingered in their minds, sparking dreams of change, opportunity, and adventure. For the Brookfield sisters, it was the beginning of a spring that would be full of unexpected twists, new faces, and the trials and triumphs that come with growing up in a world that was always just a little too big and yet somehow not big enough. An unexpected invitation. The days that followed the news of Mr. Elliot Grant's arrival were filled with speculation across Heatherwood, and the Brookfield household was no exception. The sisters spoke of little else, imagining what the mysterious businessman might be like and how he might alter the quiet rhythm of their town. Josie, in particular, was eager for new stories, seeing Mr. Grant as the protagonist of an epic tale yet unwritten. One crisp morning, as Lydia and Josie were finishing breakfast and Sarah was tidying up the small parlor, a letter arrived. Annie, who had run out to the garden to collect it, bounded back inside with breathless excitement. "Lydia!" "Josie, look," she cried, waving the sealed envelope in the air. "It's addressed to us, from Mr. Elliot Grant." Lydia reached out and took the letter, examining it closely. It was a handsome envelope, slightly scented with lavender and neatly written in fine, looping script. "It must be a mistake," she said doubtfully, glancing at Josie, whose eyes shone with anticipation. "Open it," Josie urged, unable to contain herself. "What if it's something important?" Lydia carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Her eyes skimmed over the elegant handwriting, and as she read aloud, her voice was a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Miss Lydia Brookfield, Miss Josephine Brookfield, Miss Sarah Brookfield, and Miss Annie Brookfield. It would be my great pleasure to welcome you all to Sutton Manor this coming Saturday afternoon for tea. I wish to make the acquaintance of my new neighbors and hear your thoughts on this fine community. I do hope you will accept this invitation. Yours sincerely, Elliot Grant. Josie leapt up from her chair, clapping her hands in delight. He wants to meet us. I told you he would bring excitement. Sarah, who had been quietly listening, looked both pleased and a little wary. Why us, though? He doesn't know us. There must be plenty of other families he'd want to meet. Perhaps he's heard about our family's fine reputation, Lydia said, trying to sound sensible, though her cheeks were slightly flushed. Or maybe Mrs. Mayhew spoke well of us, considering we're close by. Annie, who had been unusually silent, spoke up at last, her eyes wide with wonder. Imagine, we'll be in that grand mansion, like characters in one of Josie's novels. Lydia's sense of responsibility soon took over, and she sighed. We have no suitable clothes for such an occasion, she said. Our best dresses are worn and patched, and I certainly can't afford to buy new ones. Then we'll make them presentable, Josie said, her tone firm. Sarah, you can add some of your lovely lacework to the sleeves, and Lydia, you can mend the hems. I'll help Annie with her hair. The four sisters set to work with fervor over the next few days, the household buzzing with energy. Even Lydia, who had initially worried about making the right impression, found herself excited about the upcoming visit. It felt as though a door was opening, perhaps not to wealth or luxury, but to a new experience that was rare in their everyday lives. Saturday afternoon arrived with an air of anticipation. The sisters, dressed in their freshly mended clothes, stood before the imposing gates of Sutton Manor, feeling both small and bold. The mansion was as magnificent as the rumors had described, tall, with ivy-covered walls, a broad front porch, and large windows that glinted in the afternoon sun. A butler met them at the door and ushered them inside with a polite bow. The parlor they entered was opulent, filled with fine furniture, paintings, and the faint scent of roses. Mr. Grant himself was waiting, a tall man in his mid-twenties, with fair hair and sharp, thoughtful eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room. "Welcome, Miss Brookfields," he said warmly, stepping forward to greet them. "It's a pleasure to meet you at last." Lydia, the natural spokesperson, managed a graceful curtsy and replied, "Thank you for inviting us, Mr. Grant. We are honored." Josie was studying him intently, taking mental notes for future stories. She was struck by the combination of his easy smile and the hint of formality that lingered in his manner. "I hope you'll forgive me for the sudden invitation," Mr. Grant continued. "As a newcomer to Heatherwood, I wish to understand the people here and learn about the community from those who know it best." Annie, typically shy around strangers, found herself surprisingly comfortable in Mr. Grant's presence. "And what do you think of Heatherwood so far, Mr. Grant?" she asked boldly. "It's a charming town," he answered, a touch of amusement in his voice at Annie's directness. "Smaller than Boston, of course, but I find the quiet quite refreshing." They settled into chairs around a large polished table laden with tea and an assortment of scones, cakes, and fruit. The conversation flowed easily, touching on topics ranging from the local church to the possibility of the new factory providing much-needed jobs. "What made you choose Heatherwood?" Josie finally asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "It's not exactly a bustling place." Mr. Grant's expression grew more thoughtful. "I've always preferred the honesty of small towns. There's something real here, something grounded. Boston is full of ambition, but not all of it is as genuine as the people here." The sisters nodded, finding a surprising resonance in his words. Even Lydia, who had been cautious at first, felt herself warming to this young man who seemed both worldly and approachable. As the afternoon wore on, Mr. Grant spoke more about his plans for the factory. "I want it to be more than a source of work," he said. "I hope it will improve the town, better roads, a school for the children, maybe even a library." At the mention of a library, Josie's eyes lit up. "A library? Do you mean that?" "Yes," Mr. Grant confirmed, smiling at her enthusiasm. "I've always believed that knowledge should be accessible to all." The sisters' spirits were lifted by the promise of something new, something that could change the landscape of their small world. When they finally rose to leave, Mr. Grant escorted them to the door himself. "I hope we'll see more of each other," he said, his gaze lingering on them. "I have a feeling you'll have much to contribute to this town's future." Lydia nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. We're grateful for your kindness." The sisters made their way home, chattering excitedly about the visit. The day had left them with a renewed sense of possibility, as though Sutton Manor itself had breathed new life into their dreams. Dreams and disappointments. The Brookfield sisters returned to their modest home with a strange new energy. As dusk settled over Heatherwood, they gathered around the small kitchen table, reliving every detail of their afternoon at Sutton Manor. Lydia put on a pot of tea, while Josie perched on the armrest of an old chair, still buzzing with excitement. "Imagine, a library right here in Heatherwood," Josie said dreamily, her eyes glowing. "I'd spend all my time there, writing stories and reading to my heart's content." "Mr. Grant does seem sincere about wanting to improve the town," Sarah agreed, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "But I wonder how the others will take to his ideas. People here don't always welcome change, you know." "Change is exactly what we need," Josie replied firmly. "And maybe we can be part of it somehow. Perhaps we could organize a gathering to support the new factory." Lydia frowned slightly, always the realist. "We must be cautious, Josie. Not everyone shares our excitement. You know how Mrs. O'Brien feels about outsiders. She thinks Mr. Grant's arrival will disrupt the town's peace." "Disrupt it?" Josie scoffed. "He's trying to improve it, not disrupt it. People are too set in their ways. Sarah, who was often the peacemaker among them, spoke gently. "Lydia is right, Josie. We should support Mr. Grant, but we need to understand how the town feels. Otherwise, we'll only make enemies." Annie, who had been unusually quiet, looked up from her plate. "Do you think he'll invite us again?" she asked, a hint of longing in her voice. Josie leaned over and tousled Annie's hair affectionately. "Of course he will. We made a good impression, didn't we?" Annie nodded, but Lydia's gaze remained thoughtful. "Impressions are one thing, Josie. Actions are another. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Despite Lydia's caution, the promise of Mr. Grant's plans lingered like a sweet perfume. For Josie, it was the chance she'd longed for, to be part of something greater than the small, ordinary life she felt trapped in. She spent the following days penning stories inspired by the mansion and its new inhabitant, her imagination ablaze with plots of intrigue and romance. Meanwhile, Lydia's concerns began to weigh heavily. She had always been the one to balance dreams with practicality. That week, she found herself more consumed by the household accounts than usual. Bills were piling up, and the girls' small mending business wasn't earning enough to keep up with the expenses. Though she did her best to hide her worries from her sisters, the strain began to show in her tired eyes and furrowed brow. One chilly afternoon, as she sat by the window sewing patches on a dress, she noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Mrs. O'Brien, the stout, no-nonsense woman who lived 3 houses down and had a reputation for knowing everything about everyone in town. Lydia set aside her work and opened the door before Mrs. O'Brien could knock. "Good afternoon, Mrs. O'Brien," she greeted politely. "Afternoon, Lydia," Mrs. O'Brien said briskly, stepping inside uninvited. "I hear you girls paid a visit to Sutton Manor." Lydia nodded, feeling a knot form in her stomach. "Yes, Mr. Grant invited us for tea." Mrs. O'Brien sniffed, her expression hard to read. "You be careful with that one, Lydia. Men like him come to towns like this with grand ideas but not always the right intentions. And mark my words, factories bring trouble as much as they bring jobs." Lydia tried to keep her tone even. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. O'Brien, but Mr. Grant seemed sincere in wanting to help the town." "Sincere or not, changes like this affect everyone," Mrs. O'Brien replied. "You've got your sisters to think of, and you've been managing well enough without meddling men." Lydia felt a flicker of frustration but kept her composure. "Thank you for your advice. I'll be sure to take it to heart." As Mrs. O'Brien left, Lydia sank back into her chair, her mind whirling with conflicting thoughts. She wanted to believe in Mr. Grant's good intentions, but she also knew that hope alone couldn't pay bills or mend frayed dresses. The following Sunday, the Brookfield family attended church, as was their routine. After the service, Mr. Grant appeared among the crowd, greeting townspeople with a warm smile. When he reached the sisters, he addressed Lydia directly, his voice filled with friendly sincerity. "Miss Brookfield, it's good to see you all again," he said, tipping his hat. Lydia managed to smile. "Good morning, Mr. Grant. It's kind of you to join us here." "I wouldn't miss it," he replied. "It's important to understand the heart of the community, and the church seems like a fine place to start." Josie, unable to hold back her enthusiasm, jumped in. "Have you made any more plans for the library yet, Mr. Grant?" Mr. Grant's face brightened at the mention of it. "I have indeed. I hope to open it by next spring, though I'm still looking for volunteers to help organize the books once they arrive." "I'd love to help," Josie blurted out before Lydia could stop her. Mr. Grant's eyes twinkled. "I was hoping you might say that, Miss Josie. Your passion for books is evident, even from the little we've spoken." Lydia couldn't help but admire how easily Mr. Grant engaged with people. Yet, as she watched Josie speak eagerly about plans for the library, she felt a pang of anxiety. Josie was already imagining a future that might never materialize, and Lydia wasn't sure how to protect her sister from disappointment. That evening, back at the Brookfield house, the sisters were still talking about the church meeting. But Lydia's mood had shifted from hopeful to somber. "Josie, you must be careful not to get too attached to this idea," Lydia warned as they cleared the dinner table. "Mr. Grant's plans sound wonderful, but they're not guaranteed. If things fall apart, I don't want you to be crushed." Josie's expression hardened, a rare show of defiance. "Why must you always expect things to fall apart, Lydia? Not everyone who offers hope is lying." "It's not about expecting failure," Lydia said quietly. "It's about preparing for it, so it doesn't break you when it comes." The tension between the sisters settled like a heavy fog, and even Sarah and Annie seemed subdued. The reality of their circumstances was creeping in, despite the sparks of excitement Mr. Grant had brought to their world. As Lydia lay awake that night, she wrestled with a mix of hope and fear. She longed for something beyond the endless cycle of work and worry, yet she also knew that a single misstep could send everything tumbling down. The next morning, she rose early, determined to find more mending work. While Josie scribbled furiously in her journal, Sarah sketched silently by the window, and Annie watched the sunrise, wondering what the next day would bring. A dance in the distance. 2 weeks passed since the church meeting, and the weather turned brisk, signaling the approach of early winter. The Brookfield sisters continued with their usual routines, though each was now infused with a spark of something new. Josie's stories grew bolder, inspired by the prospect of the library. Sarah's sketches had a livelier spirit, echoing the changing hues of the landscape. Annie's curiosity seemed endless, her questions constantly drifting toward the skies or Mr. Grant's future plans. Lydia, however, remained practical. She focused on the day-to-day chores and the unending task of making ends meet. But even she couldn't deny the sense of anticipation that lingered like the scent of fresh pine in the air. One chilly afternoon, a letter arrived once again at the Brookfield house. This time it was a small, cream-colored envelope, sealed with the same lavender-scented wax that had marked Mr. Grant's previous correspondence. Annie, who had brought it in, handed it to Lydia with wide eyes. "What do you think it says?" Lydia opened it cautiously, her brow furrowing as she read. "Miss Lydia Brookfield and Sisters, it is with great pleasure that I extend an invitation to a winter dance at Sutton Manor this coming Friday evening. It will be a small affair, meant to celebrate the season's change and bring together neighbors who have kindly welcomed me to Heatherwood. I hope you will be able to attend. Yours sincerely, Elliot Grant." Josie's eyes widened in delight as Lydia read the letter aloud. "A dance? At Sutton Manor? Oh, Lydia, we must go." Sarah's face brightened too, though her voice was gentler. "It sounds lovely, Lydia. We haven't had an opportunity like this in ages." Lydia hesitated. The idea of attending a formal dance was enticing, but she couldn't ignore the practical issues. "We have no suitable dresses, Josie. We barely managed to mend our tea dresses, but a dance requires more than patched hems." Annie, ever optimistic, said, "Can't we make something new from what we have? We still have the old blue silk that Aunt Mary left us." Lydia pondered the suggestion. The fabric was lovely, though it had been stored away for years in hopes of better times. She sighed. "It won't be perfect, but I suppose it's worth a try." Josie clapped her hands. "Then it's settled. We'll work day and night if we have to. We can't let this opportunity slip by." With that, the sisters set to work with renewed fervor, the parlor turning into a makeshift sewing room. Lydia took the lead, guiding Sarah and Josie through the stitching of the blue silk into a simple but elegant gown. Annie, in her usual spirited fashion, collected pine cones and holly sprigs to make a wreath that they could wear as a unique accessory. In the process, their bond seemed to deepen as they shared laughter, stories, and hopes for the dance. Lydia's initial reluctance softened, and she found herself looking forward to the evening, even if she couldn't quite admit it. The night of the dance arrived, and the Brookfield sisters made their way to Sutton Manor. Despite the cold, they felt warm with anticipation. wrapped in a mix of hand-me-down shawls and the newly crafted gowns. The mansion was alive with music, golden lights spilling from the windows and illuminating the snowy path that led to the entrance. They stepped inside and were greeted by a lavish sight, a grand hall filled with guests, sparkling chandeliers, and the sweet strains of a string quartet playing a waltz. Mr. Grant stood near the entrance, his demeanor gracious as he welcomed each guest. When he saw the Brookfield sisters, his eyes lit up. "Miss Brookfields," he said warmly, "I'm delighted you could make it. You all look lovely." Lydia blushed faintly, but managed a composed smile. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. We appreciate the invitation." He nodded, his gaze lingering on them a moment longer than necessary. "It wouldn't have been complete without you." The sisters dispersed into the crowd, each in awe of the scene before them. Josie, with her naturally adventurous spirit, was soon drawn to the lively conversations among the guests. She found herself speaking with Miss Emmeline Fairchild, a young woman from Boston with similar interests in literature and social causes. "I heard you've been writing stories," Emmeline said with a knowing smile. "Perhaps one day you'll publish something here in Heatherwood." Josie's eyes sparkled at the possibility. "I would love nothing more." "Do you think there's a chance for writers here?" "There's always a chance," Emmeline assured her, "especially now that Mr. Grant seems keen on bringing the arts to this little town." Meanwhile, Sarah found herself enchanted by the paintings that adorned the walls of the ballroom, drawn especially to a large landscape that depicted the rolling hills of New England. She caught the attention of Mr. Edward Thornton, a mild-mannered gentleman with an interest in art, who engaged her in conversation about the painting's details. "You have an artist's eye," he observed after listening to Sarah's thoughtful remarks. "Have you ever considered exhibiting your work?" Sarah was taken aback by the question, her cheeks flushing. "Oh, I wouldn't know where to begin. I've only ever painted for myself." "Perhaps that could change," Mr. Thornton suggested. "This town could use a gallery, you know." Sarah's heart swelled at the thought, and for the first time, she wondered if her quiet talent might have a place beyond the walls of their small home. Annie, meanwhile, was utterly charmed by the decorations, a mixture of holly, ivy, and twinkling candles. She found herself seated beside Mr. Grant, who had noticed her fascination with the holiday decor. "Do you like the way we've decorated the hall?" he asked kindly. "It's magical," Annie said with a sincere smile. "It's like a fairy tale come to life." "I'm glad you think so," Mr. Grant replied. "I wanted this evening to feel special for everyone, especially you and your sisters." Lydia, who had been observing the scene from a distance, felt a mixture of pride and unease. She knew how much this evening meant to her sisters, and she couldn't deny her own enjoyment of the music, the warmth, and the chance to feel part of something grand. But she also knew how easily dreams could be dashed, and she felt a sense of responsibility to keep her family grounded. As the night drew to a close, Mr. Grant approached Lydia, who was standing near a window, gazing out at the snowy landscape. "Are you enjoying the evening, Miss Brookfield?" he asked softly. Lydia turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "It's been a lovely night, Mr. Grant, more than we could have imagined." "I'm glad," he said, his eyes earnest. "I meant what I said about wanting to make a difference here. I hope you'll consider being part of that." Lydia hesitated, her practical side battling with a newfound sense of hope. "It's a generous offer, Mr. Grant, but you must understand, change doesn't come easily here, and promises can be hard to keep." "I understand your caution," he replied gently, "but I also see potential, in this town and in you." Lydia's heart quickened, a mix of uncertainty and longing she hadn't felt in years. Before she could respond, Josie appeared at her side, her eyes bright and cheeks flushed from dancing. "Lydia, come dance with us," Josie insisted, grabbing her sister's hand. Mr. Grant gave Lydia a small, encouraging smile. You should join them. Even the most practical souls deserve a dance now and then." With a sigh of acceptance, Lydia allowed Josie to pull her onto the dance floor. As she joined her sisters in the final waltz of the evening, the air felt lighter, as if the weight of the world had momentarily lifted. For once, Lydia let herself be part of the moment, caught between reality and the sweetness of what could be. The sisters danced together, their laughter echoing in the grand hall, not knowing what the future held, but savoring a rare moment of joy. Shadows of uncertainty. The morning after the winter dance at Sutton Manor dawned cold and clear. Snow had dusted the small town of Heatherwood overnight, leaving the Brookfield house wrapped in a soft, white blanket. Inside, the four sisters huddled around the small wood stove, still glowing from the previous night's excitement. Annie, the first to speak, couldn't hold back her joy. "I think it was the best night of my life," she declared, her cheeks still rosy from the memory of the dance, and the holly crown she had worn sat askew on her head. Josie was equally effusive. "I feel inspired," she said, her eyes sparkling. "I've decided I'm going to write a new story, a grand one about a winter ball and all the magic that comes with it." Sarah, too, seemed unusually animated. "I kept thinking about Mr. Rusk Thornton's suggestion to display my paintings," she confessed shyly. "Do you think I could really do it?" Lydia, despite her sister's infectious joy, was quieter than usual. While she had enjoyed the dance and even caught herself dreaming of possibilities, a sense of responsibility lingered, reminding her of the harsh realities of life. The rent was due soon, and the money earned from mending and sewing was barely enough to scrape by. "We should be careful not to let our imaginations run away with us," Lydia said finally, her voice steady but soft. "I know last night felt like a fairy tale, but we have practical matters to think of." Josie's face fell, and she looked at Lydia with a hint of frustration. "Why must you always bring us back down, Lydia? Can't we dream a little, even if just for a day?" "I don't mean to crush your dreams, Josie," Lydia replied gently, "but someone has to make sure we stay afloat." Annie, sensing the tension, wrapped an arm around Lydia's waist. "Lydia, it's not that we don't understand. It's just that last night was so wonderful. We haven't had anything like that in so long." Lydia softened, kissing Annie on the forehead. "I know, dear. I'm glad you all enjoyed it, but we have to stay grounded, even when it's tempting not to." As the days passed, the Brookfield sisters returned to their routines, but the effects of the dance lingered. Josie became consumed by her writing, often staying up late into the night, her candle burning low as she scribbled feverishly in her notebook. Her story, inspired by the winter ball, grew into a full-length novel, filled with characters she imagined mingling at grand parties and facing epic decisions. Sarah, meanwhile, began working more diligently on her paintings. Mr. Thornton's words had awakened a new sense of purpose in her. She painted feverishly, creating vivid landscapes of the rolling New England hills and portraits of the townspeople she observed from the window. Lydia noticed the spark in Sarah's eyes and couldn't help but feel a small swell of pride, mixed with the usual worry about where this newfound hope might lead. But while Josie and Sarah were caught up in their creative worlds, Lydia's concerns grew heavier. Their financial situation remained dire. One cold afternoon, she received a visit from Mr. Harper, the local landlord, a stout, gray-haired man with a stern face. "Good afternoon, Miss Brookfield," he said gruffly. "I'm here about the rent. I was hoping you might have it by the end of the week." Lydia's heart sank. "Mr. Harper, we're doing everything we can. We've taken on extra mending work, but times are still difficult." Mr. Harper's expression softened slightly, though his voice remained firm. "I understand, Miss Brookfield, but I can't afford to be lenient much longer. You're good girls, but business is business." Lydia nodded, her throat tight. "We'll find a way, Mr. Harper, I promise." As he left, Lydia closed the door quietly and leaned against it, feeling the weight of the world settle on her shoulders once more. She was grateful that her sisters hadn't witnessed the exchange. She knew she had to protect them from the harshest realities, even if it meant bearing the brunt of them herself. Later that evening, Lydia sat by the fire sewing patches onto a worn dress, her mind churning with worry. Josie entered the room, holding a sheaf of papers in her hand. "Lydia, I finished the first draft of my story," Josie said excitedly. "Would you like to read it?" Lydia looked up, her tired eyes meeting Josie's eager ones. "Of course, Josie. I'd love to." As Josie read aloud, her words flowed with passion and imagination, painting a vivid picture of ballrooms, snow-covered estates, and the quiet yearnings of a heroine not unlike herself. Lydia couldn't deny the beauty in Josie's words, the way her younger sister's hopes and dreams leapt off the page. "It's wonderful, Josie," Lydia said softly when she finished. "Truly." Josie's smile was wide, but her eyes held a hint of uncertainty. "Do you really think so?" "I want to send it to a publisher in Boston. I heard from Miss Fairchild that they sometimes publish works from small-town writers." Lydia's heart tightened again. "Josie, it's a beautiful story, but publishing isn't an easy path. It could take months, even years, before you see any success. I just don't want you to be disappointed." Josie's face fell, but she stood firm. "I know it's a long shot, Lydia, but I have to try. If I don't, I'll always wonder what might have been." Lydia reached out and took Josie's hand, squeezing it gently. "I understand. Just promise me that you won't let it consume you." Josie nodded, her determination undimmed. "I promise, Lydia." Meanwhile, Sarah had been busy painting a portrait of Lydia, hoping to capture her sister's strength and quiet resilience. As she worked on the piece, Mr. Thornton paid a surprise visit, bringing with him a small collection of art supplies. "I thought you might need these," he said with a kind smile, handing her a box of new paints and brushes. "Every artist deserves good tools." Sarah's eyes widened with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. This is more than I could have hoped for." He looked at her unfinished painting, observing the details with a critical but encouraging eye. "You have a natural talent, Miss Sarah. But remember, the world of art can be unpredictable. You must have both skill and resilience to make it." Sarah nodded, feeling both inspired and cautious. "I understand, but I'm willing to try." Mr. Thornton smiled warmly. "Good. And remember, if you ever wish to exhibit your work, I'm more than willing to help." The offer was tempting, and Sarah felt a sense of possibility unfurl within her. She imagined her paintings hanging in a gallery, bringing color to the lives of others. As the days wore on, the Brookfield sisters faced a mix of triumphs and trials. Josie sent her manuscript to a publisher in Boston, holding on to the hope of a response that could change everything. Sarah began to plan a small, informal exhibition of her work, with Mr. Thornton's encouragement. Annie continued to explore her curiosity, asking questions that stretched beyond the boundaries of Heatherwood. But Lydia remained the steady anchor, grappling with the financial strain that threatened to pull them under. She worked tirelessly, taking on extra mending jobs, and even considering taking up cleaning work at a local inn. Her pride chafed at the thought, but she knew she had to do whatever it took to keep her family afloat. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of work, Lydia sat alone in the parlor, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The house was silent, her sisters asleep, and she felt the crushing weight of responsibility pressed down on her. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Mr. Grant standing there, his expression serious. "Miss Brookfield," he said quietly, "I hope I'm not intruding." Lydia, surprised and unsure of his reason for visiting, managed a nod. "Not at all, Mr. Grant. What brings you here so late?" "I heard from Mr. Harper about your situation," he said, his voice filled with concern. "I want to help, if you'll allow it." Lydia felt a mixture of relief and pride clash within her. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Grant, but we can manage, we always do." Mr. Grant's eyes were sincere as he replied, "I understand your pride, Lydia, but sometimes accepting help isn't a weakness. It's a step toward something better." Lydia's resolve wavered, her exhaustion momentarily breaking through. "I don't want to depend on others, Mr. Grant. We've had to rely on ourselves for so long." He nodded, his voice gentle. "And that's admirable, but I'd like to think that sometimes even the strongest among us need a hand." For the first time, Lydia allowed herself to consider the possibility of accepting help, not as a failure, but as a way forward. The prospect was both daunting and liberating, like the sudden, sharp intake of winter air. New paths. The next morning, Lydia awoke to a sense of determination she hadn't felt in some time. Mr. Grant's offer to help had sparked something within her, a recognition that perhaps her pride was keeping not only herself but also her sisters from moving forward. Still, she was cautious. Accepting help, especially from a man she barely knew, was a delicate matter. At the breakfast table, Lydia cleared her throat. "I've been thinking," she began, drawing her sister's attention. "Perhaps we need to approach things differently." Josie paused, a piece of toast halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean, Lydia?" "I mean," Lydia continued slowly, "that maybe it's time to consider accepting the help we're offered, within reason. Mr. Grant's intentions seem genuine, and if there's a way to make our lives more stable, it might be foolish to refuse it outright." Sarah looked intrigued. "Do you really think we can trust him, Lydia?" Lydia met Sarah's gaze. "I'm not entirely certain, but I do know that sometimes the hardest part is learning to receive as well as give. We've been so used to doing everything on our own that we might have missed out on opportunities to better our situation." Josie nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose you're right, and he did seem sincere about wanting to help the town, not just us." Annie, her eyes bright with hope, asked, "Does that mean we might be able to get more supplies for Sarah's paintings? Or perhaps more books for the library?" Lydia smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but we must be cautious. We don't want to become dependent on promises that may not come to fruition." The sisters agreed, each feeling a tentative sense of optimism. Lydia decided she would speak to Mr. Grant again, not to accept charity, but to explore whether there was a way to work together that would benefit both her family and the town. Later that day, Lydia found herself standing outside Sutton Manor once more, feeling a mixture of resolve and vulnerability. She was greeted by the same butler who had welcomed them at the dance, and soon she was ushered into Mr. Grant's study. The room was lined with bookshelves, maps, and a large oak desk cluttered with papers. Mr. Grant stood as she entered, his expression warm but curious. "Miss Brookfield," he said, motioning for her to sit. "I wasn't expecting to see you so soon. Is everything all right?" Lydia took a deep breath before speaking. "I came to discuss your offer, Mr. Grant. I want to be clear. I am not here to ask for charity, but if there's a way for my sisters and me to contribute to your plans for the town, I am willing to consider it." Mr. Grant's eyes lit up with interest. "I admire your straightforwardness, Miss Brookfield, and I assure you my intentions were never to make you feel indebted. I had hoped you might consider a partnership of sorts." Lydia's brow furrowed slightly. "A partnership? What do you have in mind?" "I plan to start a series of educational programs for the factory workers," he explained. "It's something I believe in, teaching skills that extend beyond the workplace. Your sister Josie has a gift for words and storytelling, and I think she could be invaluable in creating materials and organizing reading sessions." Lydia's eyes widened. "Josie, you think she could manage that?" "I do," he affirmed. "I've seen how passionate she is about books and education, and as for Sarah, her art could be part of a small gallery I'm planning to set up in town. We could showcase local artists and bring some culture to Heatherwood." Lydia was surprised by the depth of his plans. "And what about Annie?" Mr. Grant smiled. "For Annie, I have something different in mind. There's a small observatory near the edge of the estate that's been neglected for years. I thought she might be interested in exploring it, perhaps even learning a bit of astronomy from my friend, Professor Hall. who visits from time to time. Lydia felt a surge of hope, though she kept her voice measured. "You've thought this through, haven't you?" "Yes," Mr. Grant admitted, "but I needed to know if you and your sisters were open to it." Lydia nodded slowly. "I think we could be. But we must move forward carefully, Mr. Grant. I want to make sure that what we build together is sustainable and fair." "Agreed," he said, extending his hand. "Let's take it one step at a time." Lydia shook his hand, feeling a sense of possibility she hadn't allowed herself to entertain in years. As she left Sutton Manor, she felt lighter, as if a small part of her burden had been lifted. Back at the Brookfield house, Lydia shared the news with her sisters. Josie was overjoyed at the thought of teaching workers to read and write, while Sarah was thrilled by the idea of a gallery that could display her art. "Oh, Lydia," Josie exclaimed, practically dancing around the room. "This is everything I've ever wanted. To write, to teach, to make a difference." Sarah's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Imagine people actually coming to see my paintings, Lydia. It's more than I ever hoped for." Even Annie was thrilled by the idea of the observatory. "Stars and planets, right here in Heatherwood. I can hardly believe it." Lydia smiled at her sister's enthusiasm, but she remained practical. "This is only the beginning, girls. We must work hard to prove ourselves, and we must be prepared for setbacks." Josie nodded, her eyes still bright. "We know, Lydia, but at least we have a chance now." Over the next few weeks, life for the Brookfields took on a new rhythm. Josie started working on reading materials for the factory workers, putting her storytelling skills to practical use. She felt a sense of fulfillment as she saw workers eagerly picking up the booklets she'd crafted. She even organized evening reading sessions, where she read aloud to small groups, their faces attentive and curious. Sarah, meanwhile, poured her heart into painting with a newfound purpose. Mr. Thornton continued to visit, offering advice and encouragement. With his support, Sarah prepared several pieces for the gallery Mr. Grant had set up, a small but cozy space on Main Street that quickly became a point of pride for the town. Annie's explorations at the observatory were equally transformative. She learned how to operate the telescope, with Professor Hall guiding her through the constellations. She felt as if the stars were no longer distant points of light, but companions she was coming to know intimately. Even Lydia found herself with a lighter heart. Though she still worked tirelessly to manage the household, she felt less alone in her efforts. She continued to assist Mr. Grant in planning educational programs, often visiting the factory to meet the workers and understand their needs. She admired Mr. Grant's commitment, though she remained guarded, unsure of the feelings that occasionally surfaced when she was near him. But one evening, as Lydia was finishing her work, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Mr. Grant standing there, a look of concern on his face. "Miss Brookfield," he began, his tone serious, "I've just received some news that may affect our plans." Lydia's heart sank. "What is it?" "There's been resistance from some of the factory owners," he explained. "They're not entirely supportive of the educational programs, fearing it may encourage workers to demand more rights." Lydia felt a mix of anger and disappointment. "But these programs are meant to help, not harm." "I know," Mr. Grant said quietly, "but progress often meets resistance. I wanted to warn you that things may become difficult." Lydia's resolve hardened. "We won't give up, Mr. Grant." "Not now." Mr. Grant's eyes softened and he nodded. "I didn't expect you would, Lydia, and neither will I." As he left, Lydia felt a surge of determination. She knew that the road ahead would be far from easy, but for the first time, it was a path she was willing to fight for, not just for her family, but for the future they were building together. Winds of resistance. Winter deepened over Heatherwood, bringing heavy snow and frigid winds. The Brookfield sisters had settled into their new routines, finding a sense of purpose in their different endeavors. Josie's reading sessions with the factory workers were becoming more popular. Sarah's art had drawn a modest but steady interest in the gallery, and Annie's nights at the observatory continued to expand her sense of wonder. But despite the progress, Lydia couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Mr. Grant's warning about resistance had proven accurate. Rumors began to circulate among the townspeople, Some viewed the educational programs as a threat, fearing that teaching workers to read and think independently would lead to demands for better wages and working conditions. One chilly afternoon, while Lydia was helping to organize a new shipment of books for the library, she overheard a conversation between two factory workers. "I heard Mr. Grant's trying to turn the workers against the owners," one man grumbled. "All this talk about rights and education, it's trouble." "Maybe he's just trying to help," another worker argued. "I wouldn't mind learning a thing or two if it meant a better life." Lydia's heart sank at the discord. Despite her best efforts to make the programs welcoming and beneficial, fear and suspicion seemed to be growing among some of the townspeople. That evening, Lydia gathered her sisters around the parlor stove. She shared what she had heard, her voice filled with worry. "We're facing more resistance than we expected. I'm afraid it could hurt the progress we've made." Josie's face was set with determination. "We can't back down now, Lydia. This is exactly why we need to keep pushing forward." Sarah was more hesitant. "But what if they're right, Lydia? What if it does cause trouble, more than we can handle?" Annie, ever the optimist, piped up. "Sometimes a little trouble is what's needed to make things better. Didn't Mr. Grant say progress is never easy?" Lydia managed a small smile at Annie's courage. "Yes, he did. But I also know that if the resistance grows, it could put our own work at risk." Josie reached out and squeezed Lydia's hand. "Then we must be prepared to face it together, Lydia. We've come this far. We can't give up now." Lydia nodded, her resolve strengthening. "You're right, Josie. We've started something important, and we must see it through, no matter what comes." The following day, Lydia went to see Mr. Grant at Sutton Manor, hoping to discuss the situation. She found him in the study, surrounded by papers and maps. His face was more tired than she remembered, the weight of the conflict evident in his eyes. "Miss Brookfield," he said, standing as she entered. "I'm glad you're here. I've been meaning to speak with you about the recent developments." Lydia took a seat across from him. "I've heard the rumors, Mr. Grant. It seems some people believe we're causing more harm than good." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's true. Some factory owners have expressed their displeasure more directly. They're worried that educated workers will demand better treatment, which would affect their profits." Lydia's jaw tightened. "So they'd rather keep people ignorant than improve their conditions?" "Unfortunately, yes," Mr. Grant said. "But I refuse to abandon the programs. We just need to be smarter about how we approach it." Lydia considered his words. "Perhaps we could focus on smaller successes first. If people see tangible benefits, like better reading skills or basic arithmetic, they might be more willing to support the effort." Mr. Grant nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "That's a wise approach, Lydia, and it's one I'd like to pursue with your help." Lydia's heart warmed at his confidence in her, but she remained wary. "I'll do whatever I can, but we must be prepared for setbacks, even more than before." Grant's expression softened. "You've shown more strength than many would in your position, Lydia. I've come to admire that about you." Lydia blushed slightly, taken aback by his words. "It's not strength, Mr. Grant. It's simply necessity." "Sometimes necessity brings out the best kind of strength," he replied gently. Their conversation drifted toward personal matters, and Lydia found herself sharing more about her family's struggles than she had intended. Mr. Grant listened attentively, his expression sincere. "You've carried a heavy burden, Lydia," he said, "but you've done so with grace. I hope you know that." Lydia felt a strange mix of gratitude and vulnerability. "Thank you, Mr. Grant, but I'm not sure grace has anything to do with it." "Perhaps not," he said with a small smile, "but it makes all the difference." Meanwhile, Josie faced her own challenges at the factory reading sessions. Despite the enthusiasm of many workers, there were a few who remained skeptical and vocal in their opposition. During one session, a man named Tom Berenger stood up and addressed Josie with a hard look in his eyes. What's the point of all this reading and writing, Miss Brookfield? You think it's going to change our wages or make the bosses treat us better? Josie paused, feeling the eyes of the room on her. I don't know if it will change things overnight, Mr. Beringer, she replied honestly. But I do know that knowledge is power, and once you have that, no one can take it from you. Beringer shook his head, unconvinced. Power or not, it won't put food on the table. Josie's face flushed, but she stood firm. You're right, it won't. But it might open doors to better opportunities, even if they're small ones. Isn't that worth trying for? There was a murmur of agreement from some of the workers, but others remained silent, unsure whether to trust Josie's optimism. After the session, Miss Emmeline Fairchild, who had become a regular attendee, approached Josie. You handled that well, Josie. Not everyone can see the value in education immediately, but you've planted a seed, Josie sighed. I hope you're right, Emmeline. It's hard to keep faith when you're met with so much doubt. Change is always met with doubt, Emmeline said wisely, but it's the ones who persevere that make a difference. As for Sarah, her exhibition at the gallery faced unexpected criticism. While many praised her work, some local artists felt she hadn't earned her place. One afternoon, Sarah overheard two women speaking as they viewed her paintings. Her work is lovely, one woman said, but she's so young. It's not fair that she gets a whole display. Perhaps she has connections, the other woman suggested with a sniff. Mr. Thornton seems quite interested in her progress. The words stung Sarah, who had always believed in earning her opportunities. She confided in Lydia that evening, her voice shaky with doubt. I didn't ask for any favors, Lydia, she said. I just wanted people to see my art for what it is. Lydia hugged her sister tightly. You deserve this chance, Sarah. Don't let the opinions of a few people make you doubt yourself. You've worked hard, and it shows. Sarah nodded, but the sting of the criticism remained. I know, but it's hard not to let it affect me. Then let it push you to do even better, Lydia encouraged. You have a gift, Sarah. Use it, no matter what people say. Annie, meanwhile, was oblivious to the tensions around her, still caught up in the magic of the stars. Her time at the observatory continued to fill her with awe, and Professor Hall had even invited her to assist with a small lecture he was planning for the townspeople. But Annie's enthusiasm was dampened when she overheard some neighbors discussing the uselessness of studying astronomy. Staring at stars won't help pay the rent, one man said dismissively. Better for her to learn something practical. Annie's excitement wavered, but she shared her doubts with Josie that night. Do you think it's silly, Josie? My love for the stars? Josie shook her head fiercely. Of course not, Annie. You have a rare passion, and that's a gift. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Annie nodded, her resolve returning. Then I won't stop. Not for anyone. As the sisters faced their individual challenges, they found strength in each other. The resistance they encountered only fueled their determination, even as it threatened to unravel the progress they'd made. They knew that the path to change was never easy, but they were more committed than ever to see it through. Together. Breaking points. The cold days of winter settled over Heatherwood with a relentless chill, pressing down on the town like a heavy blanket. For the Brookfield sisters, the biting winds were only a small part of the hardships they faced. Resistance to their projects had grown more overt, creating both external and internal tensions that threatened to disrupt the hopeful path they had embarked upon. Despite the resistance, Josie continued to press on with her reading sessions at the factory. Yet the once buzzing room now had fewer attendees, and those who remained were quieter, their eyes cautious and unsure. One evening, as Josie prepared to start a session, only a handful of workers were present. She glanced around, her heart sinking at the empty seats. What happened? She asked Emmeline Fairchild, who stood nearby. Emmeline sighed. There's been talk of the factory owners discouraging attendance. Some workers were told they'd lose hours if they kept coming. Josie's temper flared. That's unfair. They have every right to learn, to improve themselves. Yes, Emmeline agreed, her voice weary, But fear is a powerful tool, Josie. Many are afraid of losing what little they have. Josie looked at the sparse group before her, feeling both anger and a profound sense of responsibility. The dream of empowering the workers seemed to be slipping away, and the taste of defeat was bitter. Later that night, when Josie returned home, she burst into the parlor, her face flushed with frustration. Lydia, who was mending a dress by the fire, looked up in surprise. "What happened, Josie?" she asked. "It's the factory owners," Josie said, her voice shaking. "They're telling workers not to attend my sessions. How can I teach when people are too afraid to learn?" Lydia's face hardened, reflecting her sister's anger. "It's not right, Josie, but it's also not unexpected. When people feel threatened, they fight back in the worst ways." Josie slumped into a chair, her fire momentarily dimmed. "I thought I could make a difference, Lydia, but maybe I was wrong." Lydia crossed the room and sat beside her, taking Josie's hand. "You weren't wrong, Josie, but change doesn't come quickly, and it doesn't come without resistance. You've already made an impact, even if it's smaller than you hoped." Josie nodded, trying to muster a smile. "I won't give up, Lydia. I just wish it wasn't so hard." "It wouldn't be worth it if it were easy," Lydia said gently. Meanwhile, Sarah faced her own obstacles at the gallery. Though her art continued to receive praise, rumors persisted about her supposed unfair advantages, fueled by gossip about her connection with Mr. Thornton. One afternoon, as she was arranging her paintings for an upcoming exhibit, Sarah overheard a conversation between two older artists. "Her work is fine enough," one of them muttered, "but she wouldn't have gotten this far without Mr. Thornton's influence." The other artist nodded. "It's clear favoritism. There are many more experienced artists who deserve that space." The words cut deeply, and Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had never wanted special treatment. All she had ever hoped for was a chance to be seen. As she stared at her paintings, the colors suddenly seemed duller, their meanings less certain. When Sarah returned home that evening, she was quieter than usual. Annie noticed and slipped beside her on the small sofa. "What's wrong, Sarah?" Annie asked, her voice soft. Sarah tried to brush it off. "It's nothing, really. Just some things I overheard at the gallery." Annie's eyes widened. "Are they saying mean things?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "They think I haven't earned my place, that I've only succeeded because of Mr. Thornton's help." Annie wrapped her arms around her sister, offering a fierce hug. "But you have earned it, Sarah. You've worked so hard and your paintings are beautiful." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she smiled weakly. "Thank you, Annie. I just need to find a way to prove it to them and to myself." As for Annie, her enthusiasm for astronomy had not dimmed, but she found herself facing skepticism from an unexpected source. During one of her lectures with Professor Hall at the observatory, a group of townspeople had gathered to learn about the constellations. But as Annie began to explain the basics, she noticed a few dismissive murmurs in the back. "I don't see how this helps us," one man muttered to another. "Stargazing won't put bread on the table." Annie felt her cheeks burn, but she pressed on with her lecture. Afterward, she confided in Professor Hall, her voice filled with doubt. "Am I wasting my time, Professor? Maybe the others are right. Maybe it's all just fanciful." Professor Hall regarded her kindly. "Annie, the stars have inspired people for centuries, and they will continue to do so. You're bringing a sense of wonder to this town, and that's never a waste." Annie's spirits lifted a little, but as she returned home, she couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps her love for the stars was too far removed from the daily struggles of her family. Back at Sutton Manor, Mr. Grant found himself embroiled in conflicts of his own. Some of the more influential factory owners had begun to question his intentions, even going so far as to threaten withdrawing their support from the factory altogether. One evening, as Mr. Grant and Lydia discussed strategies for moving forward, he confessed his frustrations. "I never imagined there would be this much backlash," he admitted, his voice heavy. "I thought people would see the value in what we're trying to do." Lydia's gaze was steady. "You underestimated how tightly people cling to the familiar, Mr. Grant. It's not just about fear of change, it's about fear of losing control." He nodded, looking weary. I don't want to give up, Lydia, but I also don't want to put you or your sisters in harm's way. We knew the risks when we started, Lydia replied firmly, and we've come too far to turn back now.
Mr. Grant's eyes softened as he looked at Lydia.
You're a remarkable woman, Miss Brookfield. I can't imagine getting through this without your strength. Lydia felt a flutter in her chest, a mix of admiration and something more. But she quickly focused on the task at hand. We need to find a way to reassure the workers and the town, perhaps a community meeting where we can speak directly to everyone and address their concerns. Mr. Grant nodded slowly. It's a good idea, but it will be risky.
Everything worth doing is risky,
Lydia replied, her voice steady. The Brookfields decided to organize a community meeting, inviting the townspeople, workers, and even the factory owners. Josie prepared a speech about the importance of education. Sarah arranged a small exhibition of her art to show the power of creative expression, and Annie promised to bring the telescope to inspire the children who attend. The night of the meeting was cold, but the turnout was better than expected. As the Brookfields stood before the crowd, Lydia felt a mix of pride and nerves. She knew that this was their chance to show the town what they were truly working toward. Josie spoke first, her voice strong but warm. We're not here to disrupt or cause trouble. We're here because we believe in the power of knowledge. It's not about taking from anyone, but about giving everyone a chance to be better. There was a murmur of agreement, and Lydia felt a surge of hope. Next, Sarah unveiled her paintings, each one depicting scenes of Heatherwood, the snowy hills, the bustling factory, the quiet charm of Main Street. The crowd seemed captivated by her work, and Lydia noticed that even some of the skeptics were nodding in approval. Finally, Annie invited the children to look through the telescope. Their excited squeals filled the hall, and for a moment, the air felt lighter, filled with a sense of possibility. But just as the meeting seemed to be turning in their favor, a voice rang out from the back of the room. This is all well and good, but what about the real issues? It was Tom Beringer, the skeptical worker from Josie's sessions. We need better wages, not more books or paintings. Lydia stepped forward, her voice steady but urgent. And that's part of our goal too, Mr. Beringer. We want to build a community where education, art, and fair work go hand in hand, but it starts with trust and understanding. Tom seemed unconvinced, but Lydia's words had struck a chord with others. Slowly, people began to clap, first tentatively, then more confidently. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step forward. As the crowd dispersed, Lydia felt a sense of relief mixed with exhaustion. You did it, Mr. Grant said quietly, standing beside her. You reached them. Lydia looked at him, her eyes tired but bright. We reached them, Mr. Grant, but there's still so much to do. He nodded, his expression filled with determination. Then let's do it, together. The cost of change. Despite the modest success of the community meeting, the road forward was anything but smooth. The Brookfields faced continued resistance, both from the factory owners and from the more skeptical townspeople. Yet, there were also small victories. Josie noticed a slight increase in attendance at her reading sessions, and Sarah's paintings had begun to sell steadily, bringing in much-needed income. Still, the sisters could not ignore the growing rumors. The factory owners were considering a lockout, a drastic measure to halt Mr. Grant's reforms. The mere mention of it sent shivers through the town. One morning, as Lydia prepared breakfast, a knock at the door interrupted the quiet routine. She opened it to find Mr. Harper, the landlord, looking more somber than usual. Good morning, Miss Brookfield, he began, his voice low. I've heard some troubling news from the factory owners. It seems they're moving forward with the lockout. Lydia's heart sank. How soon? Within the week, Mr. Harper replied. They're planning to shut down operations entirely until the educational programs are dissolved. Anger welled up in Lydia's chest. But that's punishing the workers, not just us. Mr. Harper nodded gravely. It's their way of maintaining control, Miss Brookfield. I'm sorry. After he left, Lydia called her sisters together, her voice shaking as she relayed the news. Josie's face hardened with determination. They think they can scare us into backing down, she said fiercely. We can't let them win, Lydia. Sarah looked uncertain.
But what can we do?
If the lockout happens, many families will suffer, including us. Annie's eyes were wide with worry. We can't let the workers lose their jobs because of us. Lydia nodded, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. We'll need to speak with Mr. Grant. We can't make this choice alone. That afternoon, Lydia and Josie met Mr. Grant at Sutton Manor. His expression was tense, his eyes weary.
I heard about the lockout,
Lydia said, her voice steady.
Is there any way to stop it?
Mr. Grant shook his head. The owners are determined. They believe that halting the factory's operations will force me to abandon the programs.
Then what are we to do?
Josie asked, her voice filled with frustration. Mr. Grant looked at them both, a deep sadness in his eyes. We have two choices. We can continue to fight and risk worsening the situation for the workers, or we can pause the programs temporarily and try to negotiate a compromise. Josie's eyes blazed.
You're asking us to back down?
No, Mr. Grant replied. I'm asking you to consider a strategic retreat. Sometimes you have to lose a battle to win the war. Lydia felt torn. If we pause the programs, it could be seen as a surrender. But if we don't, the workers could suffer even more. Mr. Grant nodded slowly. It's a difficult choice, and one that shouldn't be made lightly. But I believe in the long-term goal, Lydia, and I believe in you. His words, though sincere, only deepened Lydia's inner conflict. She knew that whatever decision they made would affect not just their family but the entire community. The sisters spent the next few days in heated discussion, weighing the risks of continuing against the consequences of pausing. Each sister had a different perspective, making the decision even harder. Josie was the most adamant about pushing forward. If we give in now, it will send a message that we can be bullied into submission. Sarah was more cautious. But if we continue, we could lose the little support we've gained, and it could make things even worse for the workers. Annie, torn between her love for her sisters and her fear of the consequences, said softly, Maybe we need to pause, just for a while. We could find a different way to help. Lydia listened to each of them, her mind racing. She knew they needed to make a decision soon, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be another way, a way that didn't involve abandoning the people they were trying to help.
On the eve of the lockout, Lydia and Mr.
Grant made a final attempt to negotiate with the factory owners. They met at the largest factory in Heatherwood, a dimly lit building filled with the hum of machines that were soon to fall silent. The meeting was tense from the start. The factory owners were unmoved, their expressions hard and unyielding. We're not interested in compromises, Mr. Grant, said Mr. Walker, one of the more influential owners. We want an end to these programs, plain and simple. But you're hurting your own workers, Lydia argued, her voice rising. These are people who depend on you for their livelihoods. Mr. Walker's expression was cold, and they'll be better off when they focus on the work they're paid to do, not on books or paintings. Mr. Grant tried one last time. This is not about disrupting business. It's about improving the community, which ultimately benefits the factory as well. But the owners were unmoved. The lockout begins tomorrow, Mr. Walker said flatly.
There's nothing more to discuss.
As they left the factory, Lydia felt defeated. She turned to Mr. Grant, her voice filled with resignation. I think we have to pause, at least for now. He nodded, his face lined with worry. It's the right decision, Lydia, even if it doesn't feel like it. The next morning, the factory gates remained closed. Workers stood outside, uncertain and anxious. The news spread quickly through Heatherwood, and the mood was grim. Josie, though devastated by the decision, addressed the workers directly that afternoon. We will not stop fighting, she said, her voice steady. But for now, we must regroup and find another way. Her words were met with a mix of disappointment and reluctant understanding. As the workers dispersed, Lydia felt the weight of failure on her shoulders, even though she knew it was the only viable choice. That evening, as the sisters sat around the parlor, the mood was somber. I feel like we've lost everything we worked for, Josie said, her voice thick with emotion. Lydia reached out to take her hand. No, Josie, we haven't lost, just postponed. We'll find another way, even if it takes time. Seeds of hope. The following weeks were quiet, with a sense of suspended animation hanging over Heatherwood. The sisters focused on other tasks to keep busy. Sarah continued to paint, Annie returned to her studies at the observatory, and Josie poured her frustrations into writing a new story, this one about resilience in the face of defeat. But even as they tried to move forward, the specter of the lockout loomed large. The town's economy began to suffer, and tensions ran high among the townspeople. It wasn't until spring began to thaw the frozen ground that a new opportunity emerged. One day, Lydia received a letter from Miss Emmeline Fairchild, who had returned to Boston but kept in contact with Josie. The letter was addressed to the entire Brookfield family. Dear Brookfield sisters, I have spoken to several friends in Boston who are interested in your efforts to educate and uplift the community in Heatherwood. They are considering funding to support a new initiative, a traveling program that brings education and art to nearby towns, allowing for broader impact while also generating income for your work. If you are interested, I would be happy to arrange a meeting with the benefactors. Yours sincerely, Emmeline Fairchild. Josie practically jumped with joy when she read the letter. Lydia, this could be the answer we've been waiting for. Lydia's eyes shone with hope. It's certainly worth considering. Sarah, too, was excited. A traveling program would mean reaching even more people, and maybe even inspiring them to start similar efforts in their own towns. Annie, her eyes bright with possibility, said, and maybe I could share my love of the stars with more children, too. The sisters wrote back to Emmeline, expressing their eagerness to explore the opportunity. Within a month, the meeting was arranged, and Lydia, Josie, and Sarah traveled to Boston to present their plans. The benefactors were a mix of philanthropists, educators, and artists, all interested in supporting meaningful change in small towns like Heatherwood. Lydia spoke with clarity and conviction, outlining a plan for the traveling program that combined reading classes, art exhibitions, and basic astronomy lessons. Josie added her perspective as a teacher, while Sarah shared her vision for using art as a means of expression and healing. The meeting was a success. The benefactors agreed to fund the project, providing resources for the sisters to create a sustainable initiative. Returning to Heatherwood, the sisters felt a renewed sense of purpose. With the traveling program set to launch in the coming months, they began to prepare materials, organize schedules, and train volunteers who would join them. Mr. Grant, who had watched their progress with pride, approached Lydia one evening. You did it.